welcome to today's thesis presentation. Every year, our seniors are required to choose one or more texts that have made a significant contribution to the development of culture and knowledge in our civilization. And then they're required to explain what wisdom those texts have to teach to their more perceptive readers. The senior thesis project is considered a capstone of the entire curriculum at Founders, insofar as it requires students to demonstrate their mastery of the liberal arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And in addition, it's considered a rite of passage of sorts, insofar as it represents a first step into a life of civil discourse. Today, Alexis Hummel is going to be presenting her senior thesis on Moby Dick and the Book of Job. After her presentation, she'll receive a number of questions from the faculty panel, and then we will open up the discussion to all of you. So whenever you're ready, again.
If I asked you to sum up your last 2 years in one word, what would you say? I'm willing to bet that that word would be difficult or painful or something to that extent. The point is that most, if not all of us, have suffered through some sort of hardship, especially since the beginning of the pandemic. Unfortunately, trials and pain are part of the human experience. In our lives, we all undergo highs and lows. We can all say that at some point or another, we've been faced with suffering. But can we all say that we've suffered well? What does that even mean, and what is the key to achieving that? In the Book of Job and Herman Melville's Moby Dick, the stark contrast between the fates of their main characters, Job and Captain Ahab, reveals that if we as human beings accept the boundaries of our inherent nature, practicing humility and virtue like Job, rather than pride and vice like Ahab, we can suffer well and be resilient through our trials. By acknowledging our own fixed mortality and exercising humility and perseverance in the face of adversity, we can thrive through our tribulations and become better versions of ourselves. The Old Testament character Job is tested by Satan through a series of both physical and mental hardships, but remains faithful to God in the end, despite massive uncertainty and lack of support from his remaining friends and wife. By the conclusion of the book, Job recovers and becomes twice as wealthy in all of his possessions as he was before. God restores Job's fortunes and health, and Job becomes one of the most well-known faithful figures in the Bible. In contrast to Job, Herman Melville creates the character of Captain Ahab in his novel Moby Dick. It's a tale of harrowing adventure during which crazy Captain Ahab leads the Pequod and its voyage to exact revenge on Moby Dick, the legendary white whale, for taking his leg. Despite believing Ahab to be insane, the crew remains loyal to him, committed to following him, even to their doom. Contrarily to Job, Captain Ahab allows his suffering brought on by the white whale to spur him into insanity and eventually death. In each of their stories, Ahab and Job suffered through adversity, and their lives and well-beings are threatened. On his previous voyage, Ahab's leg was completely devoured by Moby Dick. He became crippled and struggled through immense physical pain. During the long weeks that faded into months, Melville says that Ahab in anguish lay stretched together in one hammock. Not only has he excruciatingly lost his leg to the white whale, but he must survive for weeks on end without undergoing any medical treatment, also damaging his soul in addition to the physical torment that he's experiencing. Like Ahab, Job also wrestles with both physical and mental hardships when God allows Satan to test Job's faith in God. Satan proposes that the only reason that Job is blameless and faithful to God is that God has blessed Job tremendously. God allows Satan to test this theory, and all of Job's possessions, including his family and good health, are taken from him. In a single day, the majority of his property, livestock, and children are destroyed. Job is so distraught by his losses that he begins to doubt God's goodness. Ahab and Job each suffer through trials at the hand of a more powerful being. Suffering exists because of our human nature. We don't always have the ability to change it. It's natural for human beings to search for the reason behind their suffering. We figure that if we know why we suffer, then we will know how to fix it and prevent it. Unfortunately, we need to accept the harsh reality that as humans, we don't have all the answers, and in some cases, we may never. The ability to avoid and control your own suffering, fate, and the fate of others conveys power and superiority. In these two texts, Moby Dick and God have the power to control fate and induce suffering, giving them authority over Ahab and Job. Now, throughout Moby Dick, the whale's ability is likened to that of a god. During a meeting with a ship called the Jeroboam, the insane prophet Gabriel aboard claims that some sort of god has taken the form of a whale, and that whale is Moby Dick himself. Even Ahab appears to consider Moby Dick omniscient. Talking to a decapitated whalehead strapped to the side of the Pequod, Ahab calls the whale venerable, giving the Leviathan authority and calling for respect. Many whalemen and sailors often told tales that the white whale can never die and was omnipresent. They even claimed that Moby Dick could be seen on opposite ends of the earth simultaneously. Even without the fabricated legends of Moby Dick, he's still terrifying to mankind and extremely powerful. He's too powerful for a mortal man to destroy, or let alone capture. Ishmael, the narrator, asks himself, "What am I that I should essay to hook the nose of this Leviathan?" He recognizes that mortal men are unable to conquer the whale. Because of their fixed human nature, they simply don't have the ability to overcome a being as powerful as Moby Dick. Now in the Bible, God displays authority over humans, specifically Job. The Bible begins with the book of Genesis, the first chapter of which tells of the creation of the universe, starting with light and darkness and ending with man and woman. God meticulously forms everything in existence according to his specific purpose. God is the creator of every living thing, including Job. Therefore, God has authority over him as his maker. He created the whole earth and everything on it, and he knows all the inner workings of it. Now, the power to create implies the right to destroy. So, God has full control over Job's life and fate. Eliphaz, one of Job's friends, asks, "Can mortal man be in the right before God? Can a man be pure before his maker?" This conveys that God is so perfect and powerful that man will always be imperfect and subordinate to him. Job accepts that he's inferior to God, and he expresses humility. Several times throughout his story, Job recognizes his own fixed mortality and he accepts it. He realizes that his life on earth is temporary and eventually he will leave it. He accepts his mortality as a human being and acknowledges that his days on earth are limited, while God is immortal and unchanging. Accepting your fixed mortality is the first requisite to suffering well. Now, unlike Job, Ahab denies his fixed mortality and thinks that he is immortal and godlike. While watching for whales, shortly before the final chase for Moby Dick, Fedallah, Ahab's harpooner, foretells Ahab's death and tells Ahab that only rope can kill him. Ahab mistakenly interprets Fedallah's prophecy as that he can only die by hanging, and he declares himself immortal, despite Fedallah's clear statement that he will die. He continues to deny his mortality and chase after Moby Dick. Ahab even believes that he has divine authority. He tells Starbuck that he'd strike the sun if it insulted him. He feels that he possesses godlike qualities and capabilities, even over the sun itself. Solar deities in religion and mythology are commonly known to be dominant and all-seeing. Now, moments later, Ahab goes so far as to declare his own fate by prophecy, saying that he will dismember his dismemberer. He believes that he knows what only divinity, or those with a divine gift, can know, and deliberately gives himself that authority. He genuinely believes that he will destroy Moby Dick, a being he considers powerful, and to whom he attributes divine qualities. By threatening to strike the sun and to eliminate Moby Dick, Ahab equates himself with the divine. By not only refusing to accept his fixed mortality, but also by placing himself up on a pedestal alongside the divine, Ahab is already failing to handle his suffering well. After accepting his inherent nature, Job demonstrates humility towards God. He keeps praising him for his provision and his blessings. On the other hand, Ahab continues to be prideful, believing only in his own ability and authority and depending on himself, rather than accepting his inferiority to Moby Dick. Based on Ahab's actions, he reveals pride as an assertion of self beyond what nature allows. In other words, pride here is solely trusting in and depending on your own ability, despite obvious restrictions due to your fixed human nature. Now, on the contrary, Job's actions convey humility as a relinquishment of one's own significance according to their nature. Humility is recognizing your limits as a human being and adjusting your actions and thoughts accordingly. Job sees that God is his creator. He recognizes that God has the ability and authority to both give and take away, and so he submits to God and he humbles himself. He displays humility before him, knowing that the Lord's judgment far surpasses his own. After complaining and crying out to God in his pain, Job tells God that he is of small account and will proceed no further. Job demonstrates perfect humility by explicitly admitting that he's insignificant compared to God because of his own nature as a human being. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Ahab continues to deliberately rebel against Moby Dick and his power. He believes that he is invincible and untouchable, even when against Moby Dick, who is likened to a god. Ahab fights against Moby Dick even to his death. His dying words are, "Towards thee I roll, thou all-destroying but unconquering will. To the last I grapple with thee, thus I give up the spear." Ahab doesn't relinquish his pride, even if that means dying at the hand of the enemy that he swore to destroy. He doesn't surrender his power, even though he knows that he's about to die. Since Job displays humility and recognizes that he should keep his faith in God and not in himself, he perseveres through his suffering. He continues to hold steadfast to God and persevere through his struggles. Job relies on God throughout his suffering because he discerns that he cannot rely on his own ability. In his humility, he surrenders to God and becomes a stronger person at the end of his story. While Job perseveres through his tribulations, Ahab refuses to yield to Moby Dick, and his pride only escalates and spurs him into madness. Looking out over the sea, Ahab soliloquizes and smokes his pipe, and then he releases his pipe over the water. Pipes throughout the book signify peace and a calm state of mind. So Melville is indicating that by dropping his pipe overboard, Ahab is abandoning any peace that he has left, and he's letting his madness consume him. He consciously surrenders to his madness, ultimately showing weakness and lack of virtue. He's completely consumed by his scheme of revenge on the white whale. Melville says that his intense thinking thus makes him a Prometheus. A vulture feeds upon that heart forever, that vulture the very creature he creates. The vulture which feeds upon his heart is Moby Dick, a personified devilish creature that he's fabricated in his own mind. The white whale is a real whale, of course, but Ahab believes him to be the epitome of evil, which feeds on Ahab's thoughts constantly. Ahab created this madness in himself and put these ideas into his own head. He becomes completely obsessed with his plan to take revenge on Moby Dick. Like a disease, it seizes his body and controls his every action. Job recovers after his suffering, while Ahab allows his insanity and mad desire for revenge to drive him towards his death. Job humbly repents to God for the words he had said in his bitterness and sorrow, and God restores Job's belongings twofold, and Job dies an old man full of days. He not only recovers, but he receives twice as much as he had before, all while retaining his humility. Although Ahab has a moment of humility in which he regrets the monomaniac way in which he lived his life, he doesn't relent his pride, and he dies at the wrath of Moby Dick. Just days before his death, he asks himself, why the strife of this chase? How the richer or better is Ahab now? He grieves for his lifetime, and he regrets his foolish desire for revenge. Ahab even seems to be humbled by the fact that God chooses to give him life. He inquires of Starbuck, his first mate, is it I, God, or who that lifts this arm? How then can this one small heart beat, this one small brain think thoughts, unless God does that beating, does that thinking, does that living, and not I? For one short speech, Ahab is humbled and wishes to turn his life around, and is nearly convinced by Starbuck to return to shore. Ahab experiences doubts about his desire for revenge and recognizes his fault. Regardless, he allows his pride to govern his actions. He continues to pursue the white whale and is killed in his efforts. The line of the harpoon that Ahab casts at Moby Dick after his final words, still unrelinquishing his pride, catches Ahab around the neck and drags him into the depths of the sea. Ahab throwing the harpoon himself symbolizes that he caused his own death, and that he could have prevented it by letting go of his pride. If Ahab had humbled himself and persevered through his sufferings, as Job did, and listened to those warnings about his fate and his mortality, he could have lived. Instead, he allowed his hubris to force him into self-inflicted madness, undergoing terrible and fateful consequences. Melville uses the story of Job, in contrast to Ahab, to demonstrate that Ahab's demise was his own fault, and that he could have prevented it. Despite this, Ahab remained too narcissistic to relent his deathly craving for revenge. Unlike Job, he didn't surrender to his human nature, but instead gave in to his pride, asserting himself above what his nature permitted. This led him to fall into a pit of madness and an uncontrollable thirst for revenge, ultimately dying at the hands of the creature that he swore he would kill. If Ahab had turned to humility, like he had during his brief conversation with Starbuck, he could have survived the wrath of Moby Dick. He could have thrived through his suffering and become a better person like Job. When Job was struck with his trials and his tribulations, he displayed humility before God. If we live like Job when we suffer, and we practice perseverance and humility in times of our struggle, we have the ability to become better humans and more virtuous people. But we have to decide. Will we allow ourselves to be blinded by our pride, trusting in our own ability, even when we know we're wrong, like Ahab? Or will we demonstrate humility in the likeness of Job, accepting our limits? The stories of Job and Captain Ahab should be cautionary tales to us the next time we face adversity. Consider the key to suffering well. and follow in the suit of Job rather than Ahab, turning to humility rather than pride during seasons of hardship. Thank you.
I just had a question about your approach in comparing Job with Captain Ahab. Is this something in the text of Moby Dick that you saw as a comparison that Melville is making, or is this something that you recognize thematically from the outset?
Melville does make a lot of biblical allusions in Moby Dick, and there are some references to Job. However, I think most of it was just recognizing the similarities and the contrast, but I think because he kind of mentioned Job a lot in Moby Dick, Melville did, I think it kind of helped.
Okay, excellent. So how do you see him intentionally drawing this connection through these references? Is he, you make a clear, just a comparison between Moby Dick himself and God. Is that a comparison that Ahab is making through his madness, or that Melville is making through his narrative? Are we, the reader, supposed to see Moby Dick as divine in the same way that Ahab seems to?
I think a lot of it, there's this whole theme that we've talked about when we learned about Moby Dick, which is it just a fish? Is Moby Dick just a whale? And I think that it's Ahab and it's the sailors that are creating these superstitions about Moby Dick and creating these tall tales about him. I think it's something that they create. I don't know if it's something that Melville is trying to do. I think it's showing that they believe that he's some sort of divinity.
Thank you. Yes, that is just fast.
So you've talked about the idea that Ahab is pursuing vengeance, right, instead of something else. That's kind of what you proposed, right? That it's vengeance. Is there a difference between vengeance and justice? I'm even thinking about if we had a shark off the coast that ate someone's leg, we would probably put that shark down, right? Like there is a sense in which you could view this as courage and justice on his part. So then how would you understand the difference between, like what are the key parts that are the difference between vengeance and justice?
I think that the main difference is that vengeance has an evil motive behind it, and it's a selfish thing. And I think that justice is a virtue, after all. It has a good motive behind it. So I think that's the main difference. That's where it lies in the motive.
Then, okay, completely different question. Good job. Because one of the pieces of your main argument here is that suffering is often, the reason behind it is often beyond our reach, right? Is there ever a time where a reason behind suffering is within our reach? Like this is something we can do?
I think when we make choices that could hurt us is when it's suffering that we do know the reason behind it. More like an internal thing, I think, rather than an external thing. But I think, yeah, whenever you make bad choices that could lead to suffering, and it would be your fault if you do that.
Okay. I have two main questions. Towards the end of your presentation, you talked about, I think it's in the symphony chapter, right, when Ahab has those moments where he seems seems more humble. Is Ahab Ahab? Is it I, God, or who that lives this and, right? Nevertheless, he perseveres in his pride. I guess I'm wondering, is that so out of character for Ahab? That seems to be one of the most striking moments where he recognizes that God is behind all of this. It seems to me there are numerous times throughout the book where he says similar things. I think it's chapter 37 where he's got that soliloquy. He says, swerve me. Against not swerve me lest you swerve yourselves. He talks about how his life is sort of on these iron rails whereon his soul is grooved to run. He seems to think that his pursuit of the whale, the reason he's so confident that he's going to kill the whale is because he has been predetermined by God to do so. And so I'm wondering, well, I'm not suggesting that's humility. It does seem to me that I don't know that he considers himself equal with God. It seems like he recognizes that God is his creator and has predetermined all things. But I guess how is that? He recognizes some sort of inferiority, but he fails to be humble. What's the difference there? Why is that sort of recognition of being in second place? Why does that still fail to be true humility?
I think because he still retains that pride. Like while he does realize that God created him and maybe he was predestined to go after Moby Dick, he still, I think it's also still the whole vengeance thing and the motive behind what he's doing, and
I think there's something to that, right? There's got to be something in the motive, because it also occurred to me before that if anybody has faith in God in a certain way, Ahab does. Because you really got to believe in God to go on a 3-year journey and go across the world to kill him. But once again, just like in the case of humility, clearly it falls short of faith. But there is this strange, how can he be so certain of the existence of God, yet it falls so far short of faith? And again, how can he recognize God's superiority and yet not even approach humility?
Again, the choice that he makes, he doesn't choose, he recognizes the fact that God created him, but he still doesn't accept it, I think. Like, not accept that God didn't create him, but doesn't accept that he needs to have that humility in the face of God, in the face of Moby Dick, that he still goes after Moby Dick, even though he knows that even with the thing like with Fadala foretelling his fate, I think so he does to some extent believe in some sort of spirituality and things like that, but he puts himself above that and gives his own prophecy. So I think he still is in some sense equating himself with the divine figure, with the God.
Okay. That makes sense, especially when you compare it to a figure like Job, when he's reminded that he wasn't there at the creation of the world. That's a sort of sufficient reason, whereas Ahab still wants to strike through the mask, or the decapitated head, that he's seen all the evils, yet not one word is thine. Okay. Well, my other question is different. You didn't, I know that you're primarily focusing on Ahab, but I'm wondering a lot about Ishmael, especially because you're opposing Ahab to Job, but it seems like Ishmael is clearly being opposed to Ahab within the novel, and there's a sense in which he's kind of a Job-like figure, kind of, right? He alone has escaped to tell us, that's Job's friends, but I'm wondering if Ishmael is able to make it out alive. Does he somehow follow the same process as Job? He too begins the novel with concerns and doubts about God's goodness and even his existence, and he seems to reconcile some of those fears and hypos throughout. assuming that Ishmael somehow reconciles those tensions and those fears, does he follow a similar progression to Job? Does he suffer well? Is that what he lives?
Maybe not, I don't know. This is something I thought about.
Yeah,
Because I think mostly when I was reading this, I was focusing on Ahab.
sure.
Especially when I first read it, I did see the similarities, especially with I alone have a safe fatality. I did see the similarities between Ishmael and Job, but I think when I was doing this, I was mostly focusing on Ahab.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I think that's right. I don't think Ishmael provides the same answer that Job does. He has humility exactly, but the question occurs to me because he too seems to be trying to understand, right? As if he could control it if he only understands this weaver God, right? And the reason for suffering, then he would be okay.
I feel like he's constantly trying to understand Ahab's motive and also just motivate himself, like throughout learning about all the inner workings of whales and things like that, and I think just watching Ahab and like as a narrator, he's constantly like telling the story from like an outside perspective. But yeah.
Okay, you stated that in observing Job, that you said that this entire interaction tests his faith in God, right? Is what your phrase that you used. I'm curious what exactly you mean by faith. Do you mean his existence? Do you mean his goodness? His ability to change things? Do you mean in other words, what is it that's actually tested in Job? And then from that, if Ahab were to have that, would that have actually solved his monomania?
I think by faith I mean he's trusting in God's ability to provide for him and the fact that God has a plan. And in Job, was it 40 verse 2? No plan of yours can be thwarted. So I think just trusting that God is working behind it, even though Job may not see what the end result is or what's going on. God still has a plan, and God is still in control of the situation, even when he feels he's out of control of the situation.
Okay, so the idea is that God is actually in control, which then enables Job's comfort and or humility as your next thing. Okay. So then is control the main thing that Ahab is contesting? Or is this?
I think to some extent, yes, because he believes that he has control over his own fate. And, when he prophesied his own fate, saying that he will dismember his dismemberer. And he told Fadal told him that he was going to die by hanging. He said, well, that's impossible. That's not going to happen. So therefore, I'm immortal. Things like that. So I think Ahab is trying to have control over his own fate. That's what he believes.
Okay. One additional. This one. Contrast Job then to his friends for me, because his friends also think God has control. It's not necessarily their issue. So what causes the tension there if we've identified that Job needs to recognize his lack of control and God's source of control? Then what's wrong with his friends? Because they also agree to control.
Well, if I remember correctly, I think it has to do a lot with the perception of God's justice, right? So, saying that, I can't remember exactly what they say, but there's something that has to do with the way that, I think they're telling Job that he can understand God, or I don't remember
answer him in the whirlwind, right? Do you see that moment as a question in humility? And so we can still attribute to Job humbleness before God? Or is that a lapse moment for Job? Because when God answers him, telling him to gird your loins like a man, Job at the end clasps his hand over his mouth, which is that humble response we've been talking about. What is the question that he has for God? I guess, what is that question? And is that a humble question, or is it a question at the peak of frustration for Job? How do you read that moment for him?
I think it's a moment of frustration, and like how anyone reacts, most people would react when they're going through suffering is, why is this happening to me? Why is God doing this? And so Job is questioning why this is happening to him, and just constantly complaining. There's so many chapters in Job where he's just complaining about the pain that he's going through. And so I think that is a lapse of humility. But then once God kind of brings that to his attention, it's like, where were you when I created the foundation of the earth? Where were you when I laid the foundations? I think he then realizes, and that's when he repents to God for everything that he said in those moments. And he has humility towards God.
Okay. So then in comparison with Ahab, the distinction is in their response to coming up against what they can know. That's a simple question.
I think that Job sees that he can't know everything, that he doesn't even deserve to know all of God's reasons for the things that he does. As a human, he's mortal, he's super insignificant compared to God, and so he doesn't deserve to know that God has, God never really explains to him. But and then with Ahab, I think he's trying to know what's happening, but I don't know. There's a difference in that.
One last question. You only get one sentence to respond.
Okay.
Is it just a fish?
Yeah, it's just a fish.
Okay, at this point, we will open the discussion to the audience.
First off, great thesis. Was with you every step of the way. It was like almost like we were taught by someone pretty okay at teaching.
It's alright, I guess.
It's like classes beard, just
Yeah.
kind of standing there talking.
Yeah.
I remember. Anyways, good job. I like the dramatic thesis at the end too. But my question is you talk about suffering well, and your answer to suffering well is not being like Ahab and not being prideful, and rather recognizing your limits and being humble. My question is how do we do that to something that is mortal, that isn't necessarily a glorified whale or God? How do we do that? Like, for example, let's say Yamato pulls me out from under my chair. And I'm suffering, my back hurts, and I'm also just the mental suffering of, oh man, I'm so embarrassed, I fell for that trick. How do I suffer well through that? I can't exactly be humble and say, oh yeah, chair moment, like, how do I suffer well through that by another human being?
I think it's accepting that sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. Just not the way that you react towards it, not reacting in anger and frustration, I think also plays a large part in humility. I think humility also goes along with like temperance and just how you react to it. So I think in that case of Yamato pulling your chair out from under you, not yelling at him and taking revenge on him, like Ahab and Moby Dick, but you know, showing grace towards him, I guess. Miss Ward.
My question is related to Dave's. When you speak of Job and the moments that he's showing humility, it seems to be in times when he is not doing things, when he is no longer questioning God, when he is not cursing, when he is accepting things. And when Captain Ahab had a moment to show humility, it was in that he could have gone back and not pursued the whale. Is humility then always passive?
I think in the way that I view it is when you have humility, you're like again going back to the choices, like you can choose to have humility. You're actively choosing to react that way. So I don't think it's always a passive thing. Can I answer your question? Sure. Tyler?
Do you think there's anything that predisposes either Job or Captain Ahab to react the way they do, to have Ahab continue to want to pursue revenge as opposed to turning to humility, or vice versa for Job?
I think so. Job, the big difference here is that Job starts out faithful to God. He always was faithful and blameless in the sight of God. Whereas Ahab, I mean, we don't get like too much of his backstory, but he definitely, you know, wasn't. It's different in that way. Like, I don't know how to explain it. I don't know how to say it. Yeah, I think, and then also, if you're looking more at like when they actually are struck with suffering, Ahab, it's something more like external, I think. Like, I don't know how to explain it, like, I don't know, just forget where I was going with that. Yes, maybe.
Okay, oh, I just had it, what was it? Oh, okay, so, I know that you said at the beginning of your thesis that you said, basically that suffering isn't something that can just go away, that suffering is a part of the human experience, that meaning it's always gonna be there. My question is, I guess the way that you're saying to remedy that suffering is to, or how to suffer well is to show humility. But I was wondering if there was any other way that you could sort of like alleviate or lessen the suffering, or is it just like, nope, you gotta show humility, that's it?
I think, I mean, can I go back to what I've been saying about having a choice? When you choose, you can choose how you react to your suffering and everything. You can view, you don't have to react like Ahab did. And I think it's also a matter of building that up. Like, I think it's something that you have to practice. You're not automatically just gonna be like, if you're faced with suffering, not being like, okay, like, that's fine, I'm just gonna live my life. And also the other premise too is like, not denying what's going on. You know, you're not denying that you're suffering. But I think accepting that something bad is happening, but I'm trying to figure out the right words. Well, not reacting in anger or frustration, but in like moderation and temperance.
So would you say that 10th grade you was not suffering well in the academic sense?
Yeah, you just hit me hard with that one. Yeah. No, I think that's true. I think that's true. Not to delve too much into that, but I think part of me thought that I could fix that on my own, and I could handle it by myself, and I could be perfect. I just tried for perfection in all my work and everything I did. You know that took me a while to realize that I'm not perfect. I can't be perfect in everything that I do, and that's okay. So, yeah.
Ahab turned Job.
Apparently.
If there are no further questions, please join me in congratulating